Well, thank you, Alex, and thanks to you, Tara, for the connection here. I'm glad to be with all of you virtually. Obviously, would have loved to have met you all in person, but we'll have to suffice with virtual for now. So my name is Katy Shanahan. I am the Ohio State Director with All on the Line, and I just want to give a bit of an introduction first before I go into sharing my screen so I can actually see some of you before you all go very small on my screen. So All on the Line is a grassroots advocacy campaign. We're part of a national effort to end gerrymandering. And our mission at All on the Line is to both increase the awareness of the harmful impacts of gerrymandering on the issues that we care about in the communities where we live across Ohio, but to also increase public participation in the redistricting process itself. So a lot of the themes of what I'll be talking about when we start to go over how the process actually works is underscoring the importance of public participation and accountability against the redistricting process itself. Obviously, Ohio reformed how we will go through that redistricting process in two different ballot measures, one in 2015 that overhauled how we'll go through the state legislative process, and then another reform measure in 2018 that reformed how we go through the congressional process. And I would love to say that those reforms can just go into autopilot and that they will churn out fair maps automatically. That would certainly make my life easier, but that will not be the case. There will be an incredible amount of public pressure and accountability work that we will all need to engage in to make sure that the process actually lives up to the promise of those reform measures and that we get the fairest maps possible. So I am going to start sharing my screen. This is a relatively small group, so I will trust you all with your mute buttons throughout the presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to come off mute and ask them as we go along. I will say here, just because I want to be respectful of your time, I'm not going to go into all of the intricacies about how the process itself works. I'll follow up an email with you, Tara, that has the flow chart of how that process works for folks to look at it. And if you have questions about it, I'm happy to answer them, but just figured it'd be helpful to give an overview of generally who the key players are in the process, some of the themes of the rules that the new maps have to meet, and then most importantly, how folks can actually plug into our work. So like I said, we're going to start in the bad place. We're going to talk about what gerrymandering has meant for Ohio for the last decade, what it looks like to be a voter here in Ohio under gerrymandered districts, but we won't land in that place for too long. We'll come out of that to talk about how we can organize around fair maps and do a little bit of an overview of how the redistricting process actually works. And then finally, because I'm an organizer at heart, we'll end with some calls to action and talk about how folks can actually plug into our work with All on the Line. So in terms of what gerrymandering looks like in Ohio, this is literally what gerrymandering looks like in Ohio. Some of our most egregious looking districts. I do have to say that just because districts are weird looking doesn't always mean that they're gerrymandering, but these ones definitely are gerrymandered, and sometimes the visual cues are actually helpful to figure out what map drawers are trying to do. So some that you may recognize, the Snake on the Lake district, Marcy Kaptur's district, that literally does not connect aside from a bridge right here. You can't actually walk from one end of the district to the other. There's Jim Jordan's Sprawling Duck District, whose tail is almost at the Indiana border and whose beak is up by Lake Erie. And then CD12, this is my own congressional district. I live right there. My street is literally cut in half between two different congressional districts. My half of the hill, unfortunately, is in CD12. So even though I live about 10 minutes away from the State House, I'm in the same district as Mansfield and Zanesville, which doesn't make a lot of sense. I have not a lot in common with the folks who live in those fine cities, but nevertheless, my neighborhood needed to be cracked apart and diluted into these districts. So we're trying to avoid districts that look like this, right? Especially ones that bridge together communities that don't make sense to be bridged together, that crack apart communities in a way to dilute the political power of who's living there. That's what we're trying to avoid in this next redistricting process. In terms of what an entire decade has looked like for voters in Ohio, this is both my least and most favorite slide to show. I just think it's the most visually impactful way to explain what the discrepancy is in Ohio between how we actually vote as Ohioans versus who actually occupies the seats. And now that we've finished the 2020 election, we have now gone through the entire decade under these current maps. So we now see what the entire life cycle is of the maps, both at the congressional and state legislative level. And we, fortunately, will never have to vote under these exact districts again. But through the entire decade, as you see in the congressional results, for example, even though Republicans just edging out Democrats by getting across the decade 55% of the vote, have picked up 75% of the seats in every single congressional race year. The Republicans always got 12 of our 16 congressional seats, not because they were picking up 75% of the vote, nowhere near that, but because they drew the districts very specifically to pack Democrats into only 4 districts and to give Republicans the rest of the 16-member congressional delegation. Again, you see that same sort of skew in our state legislative races, not quite as extreme as our congressional discrepancy between votes and seats. But here I'm showing what the 10-year span has looked like for our state House seats. The reason I don't show state Senate is just because the Senate runs only half of the chamber every election cycle. So it's just a little bit harder mathematically to sort of coordinate what all of them look like across the decade, whereas the Ohio House runs all 99 seats every single election cycle. So across a decade, again, same split in terms of votes, Republicans getting 55% of the vote, and yet they pick up 64% of the seats. So for the entire decade, even though the Republicans never won a supermajority of the vote in our state House races, they got a supermajority of the seats throughout the last 10 years. And that, again, is because that's how they're drawing the districts. The maps are working exactly how they were meant to work. The Republicans just kept increasing their supermajority in the House and in the Senate, even though they weren't increasing how many votes they were actually capturing. And the thing too with the state legislative districts is, even when you're thinking about the best years for Democrats to perform, which usually in this last decade was non-presidential years. So if you're thinking, for example, of the performance of Democratic candidates in 2018, they performed extremely well. And even though they performed that well, Republicans in 2018 picked up just 50.4% of the vote, and yet they were getting 64% of the seats. So again, it didn't matter the entire decade how well Democrats ever did. The Republicans always drew themselves into a supermajority. So this is exactly what we're trying to avoid with new maps. When you have such a huge discrepancy between how people actually vote and who actually occupies the seat, you effectively take voters out of the political equation. It's not actually us as voters who are electing those people into office. It's our politicians who are picking who their voters are. And that impact lasts long past when election day is. The other problem with our maps is that one of the side effects of our gerrymandered districts is that our races aren't competitive at all in the general election. So when you're looking at all 132 of our state legislative seats and our 16 congressional seats, in total, there are maybe 5 or 7 districts across the state that are actually competitive in the general election. And when you have such lack of competitiveness in your districts, in the general election, it means that your only competition is ever in the primary. So it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican, you're trying to pick up the base of your base in your primary. And the base of your base is not representative generally of voters. And yet that's who you're trying to win. That's where your competition is. And so that's why you get folks like, the Narajan Tanis of the world or Nino Vitalis, who are not actually representative of the districts where they live. They're representative of who their primary voters are. And that obviously carries over into the policies that they implement once they're in office, which so often do not actually line up with how we feel about these issues, despite the fact that that's what's getting implemented. So like I said, the main problem when you have such a mismatch between how Ohioans vote and who's actually in office is that our elected officials aren't accountable to us as their constituents, because we aren't picking our politicians. Our politicians in 2011 drew maps to pick who their voters were. And so maybe you are like me and spend a lot of your time complaining about who your elected officials are. And maybe your friends get tired of you doing that and say, why don't you just vote them out at the next election? But the problem is we can't actually do that. There's no way for us to hold our elected officials accountable at the ballot box because of how we've been drawn into these districts with almost guaranteed results long before election day. And like I said, that impact lasts much longer than just who's able to win on election day. And when we're looking at, even if you're just looking at what happened during lame duck is sort of like the best example of why we need fair maps on steroids, right? Because lame duck is when normally elected officials are unaccountable to you because there isn't an election day looming over their head. But when you live in a gerrymandered state, they're even more unaccountable to you than they would be otherwise. So pushing stand your ground legislation, which is not something Ohioans overwhelmingly support, pushing through 2 different anti-abortion bills, doing nothing to address COVID in a legitimate way, doing nothing to make our election in 2020 accessible or safe for people. Everything that the legislature was doing is not something that Ohioans overwhelmingly supported. And that's why we aren't able to make progress on any number of issues. I say this often, that it doesn't matter ultimately what political issue brings you to the table to want to care about our maps and what they look like. All of those issues are impacted by gerrymandering. And the fact that we haven't been able to make progress on these issues is not because Ohioans do not support them. It's because our legislators and our congressional members are not actually representative of us, and they don't need to be because they have their elections all but guaranteed because of how the Republicans drew maps in 2011. So that's what's at stake with our fight for fair map. It is literally all on the line. So that is what we are fighting for in this fight in 2021. So for us, in terms of what the solution is to fix our problem with our gerrymandered maps, is to organize around redistricting. And we know that Ohioans can organize around redistricting because we've done it in both 2015 and in 2018 when folks came together across the state to reform how we will actually go through this redistricting process. And there was quite a strong rejection of how we had done it in the past. So for us, it's about organizing and getting increased public engagement around every step of the redistricting process, even before it starts officially. There's stuff for us to be doing. Certainly we'll be advocating for fair maps as an end result, but we also want to make sure that not only the process itself is inclusive, that we're not shutting out the voices of key political communities from being able to talk about what they need out of these maps or what they think about proposed maps, but also ultimately what the maps look like at the end. But to do that, we need to make sure that we actually build transparency into the map drawing process itself. So that's what we'll be advocating for this year. So I just want to give a little bit of an overview of the redistricting process. There are 2 different sets of rules for how we will go through this process. One guides how we go through the state legislative process, how we draw our state house and state senate districts. The other guides how we draw our congressional districts. Explaining those 2 processes takes a bit of time, so I'm doing a much shorter version of this. Like I said, I'll follow up with a chart that explains each of those steps. And if you have any questions as I'm going through here, please feel free to raise them as we go on. So before we talk about the process, I want to talk about who actually runs the map making process here in Ohio. There are 3 main entities to keep in mind. 2 of them are the people who are actually our map drawers. And then the 3rd entity is who actually judges our maps once they're done. So the first entity is a new 7-member redistricting commission who is in charge of drawing our state legislative districts. And this commission is replacing what used to be called the Ohio Apportionment Board. And the 7 members on this commission are the governor, secretary of state, the auditor, and then 4 legislative nominees, 1 each from each of the legislative leaders in both the House and Senate. So you'll have the Speaker of the House, the Senate President, and then the minority leaders from each caucus, or each chamber rather, nominating 1 person to serve on this commission. Now, the rules about who they're allowed to nominate, there's only 1 rule, and that is that their nominees cannot be a current sitting member of Congress. Aside from that, they can nominate whoever they want. So it can be a legislator, it can be a non-legislator. As long as it's not a current US House representative or a US senator, you're good to go. For those of you who are keeping track at home, yes, Republicans make up 5 of those 7 redistricting commissioners, which is not very well balanced, but there are some rules sort of guiding the process, which we'll talk about in a second, which will help balance that out a little bit. The second entity in terms of who our map drawers are our legislators. The Ohio General Assembly is mostly in charge of drawing our congressional districts. The Redistricting Commission that draws the state ledge maps does also play a small part, but it's mostly the legislature who will be in charge of drawing our congressional maps. And then the final entity is who actually judges our maps. This is where the Ohio Supreme Court comes in. Baked into the Ohio Constitution as a result of those 2015 and 2018 reform measures, the Ohio Supreme Court has been given what's called original jurisdiction. That just means they're the first court who gets to review any potential legal challenge to our maps. It doesn't matter what type of challenge it is, the first stop you have to go to is the Ohio Supreme Court. Whether you can go anywhere other than the Ohio Supreme Court depends on what type of claim you're bringing. So if you are bringing a partisan gerrymandering claim to the map, you can only go to the Ohio Supreme Court. The US Supreme Court issued a decision a couple of terms ago in their Rucho case out of North Carolina that closed federal courthouse doors to partisan gerrymandering claims. So if we want to argue that our maps are drawn to favor Republicans over Democrats, the only court that will review that is the Ohio Supreme Court. Other challenges, like if it's a racial gerrymandering challenge or if it's some other federal constitution-based claim, can obviously still go to federal court, but it would first have to go to the Ohio Supreme Court. So that's who runs the process itself. In terms of some of the new criteria that the maps have to meet, I try to group these together in three major themes that guide what our new rules look like. For some general criteria, and the first two are just sort of traditional redistricting criteria that apply in a lot of different states. One is that the district boundaries have to be contiguous. That just means that there's one non-interrupted, non-intersecting line that makes the borders of the district itself. So for example, if you're thinking about that Snake on Lake district, that district is not actually contiguous. The bridge to me doesn't count in terms of making one end of the district connected to the other. So the goal there is to have one whole district and not, have some islands separated over here that's also inside the district. Another criteria is that the districts are compact. This usually isn't a huge problem for state legislative districts just because you're dealing with a much smaller population size in each of the districts. But if you're thinking, for example, of our congressional maps, a lot of our districts are not compact, and there's a reason for that, right? So if you're thinking, for example, about CD12 or even CD15, neither of those districts are compact, and they crack apart some of our central areas here in Franklin County to drown them into sprawling districts that are rural and conservative. The other set of general criteria for both the state legislative and congressional maps, for any map to last the entire decade, so to last until the next time we do the census and go through this again in 2031, you have to have some level of bipartisan support. What level of bipartisan support is necessary depends on which process it is. So for the state legislative districts that are drawn by that 7-member commission, you have to get at least 2 Republicans and both of the Democratic commissioners to sign on to that map if it's going to last for 10 years. For the congressional map, there's a varying level of support in the legislature. In the first round, you have to get at least half of the Democratic caucus to sign on to the map. In the second round, that's in the legislature, you have to get at least 1/3 of the Democratic caucus to sign on. In both processes, there are multiple opportunities for there to be bipartisan consensus on 10-year maps. And that's actually really important because a decade ago, this criteria did not exist. And so the Republicans didn't need a single Democratic vote to vote in favor of the maps because they obviously had super majorities in both chambers, and they just needed a 50+1 majority to get maps passed. And so when you have that, there's only one party that's sort of steering the ship. And here the criteria require that there's some input and buy-in from both parties in order to get a 10-year map. Now, with that said, there is still an escape hatch whereby the Republicans could push through non-bipartisan maps that only last for 4 years rather than the entire decade. So for the state legislative maps, one of the sticks sort of hanging over their head not to do that is that the Secretary of State, the auditor, and the governor, who all serve on that commission, are all up for re-election next year in 2022. And so if, for example, the commission pushed forward a 4-year state legislative map, By the time they would have to come back to redraw the map that would last for the remaining 6 years of the decade, you could potentially have Democrats capture 2 of those 3 seats, and then they would control the commission because they would have 4 of the 7 seats. So you could have a different balance of power for who would control that redraw in 4 years. Same sort of thing hangs over the head for the congressional process. So obviously you'd have legislative turnover because you'd be running under new maps starting in 2022. So you could potentially have Democrats in control of the House. I don't think we'll see Democrats taking control of the Senate anytime soon, but they could take control of the Senate, and then you'd have split control of the legislature, who would then be in charge of drawing new congressional maps. So some things keeping them from doing that. Another additional sort of stick hanging over the legislature's head in the congressional process is that if they move forward with a 4-year map, there's an additional set of criteria that is more stringent set of rules that the maps would have to meet if it's a 4-year map. And we'll talk about that in a second. The second sort of umbrella theme of rules are rules to try to curb how often we split apart communities in our current maps. If you look at our current maps, both state legislative and congressional, they are very good at surgically breaking apart communities to, like I said, drown them in surrounding rural and conservative districts. And for both the state legislative and congressional maps, there are rules that are aimed to avoid that exact type of cracking apart of communities. So for example, there's a requirement that map drawers use existing boundaries. So county lines, city lines, township lines to guide where they're drawing the districts. Now, obviously, this is not a perfect solution. If you're thinking, for example, here in Franklin County, there are a lot of suburban cities that straddle county boundaries. And so if all you're doing is judging on county boundaries, you'd be splitting Dublin in half, you'd be splitting Westerville, right? I mean, there are a lot of cities that sort of straddle on both sides of county boundaries, even just here in Franklin County. It's true in other cities across the state. But still, the idea here is that you're using existing boundaries to try to understand where communities naturally are bounded together. Similarly, there's a big interest in wanting to keep together counties as much as possible. Our current maps are very, very good at cracking apart our counties, which is very unnecessary because Ohio is a state full of cities and townships and counties that have relatively small or medium-sized populations. And so there's no need to split them as often as we do. You can draw maps that have way fewer county splits and that maintain communities in their whole within districts. So for the congressional maps, for example, the rules heavily decrease how many counties are allowed to be split how many times. So for example, under our current map, 55 of our 88 counties are split between either 2, 3, or 4 congressional districts. The new rules would require that 65 of our 88 counties stay whole. So rules like that. Additionally, in the state legislative side, state house districts should be drawn by splitting counties no more than 1 time if possible. So again, this will really shift in a lot of ways how our district boundaries are drawn, with the interest of trying to keep together communities as much as possible. The last set of rules is perhaps my favorite set. They're rules against partisan gerrymandering. Obviously, our maps are extremely partisan gerrymandered, so these rules will do a lot of good in terms of curbing that from happening in the future. Our state legislative rules are way more strong than our congressional rules on this. For state legislative maps, no matter if it's a 10-year or a 4-year map, you cannot partisan gerrymander our maps moving forward. You cannot draw maps that favor or disfavor one party over the other. For the congressional maps, that's different. The only explicit ban on partisan gerrymandering comes in if the legislature passes a 4-year map. So you remember that I said that in the congressional process, if they go forward with a 4-year map, they have stricter rules that they have to follow. One of those stricter rules is that they can't partisan gerrymander. So that's much different than the state ledge process, where you can't partisan gerrymander no matter if it's a 10 or a 4-year map. You only see that for 4-year congressional maps. An additional protection for the state legislative maps is this final criterion that I have listed here, which requires that we have representational fairness in our state legislative districts. And to explain what this means, I'm actually going to go back, if I can, to this pie chart slide. So if you're looking here at the state house results, you see a huge discrepancy between how we actually vote versus who captures the seats. And what representational fairness is trying to achieve is the idea that if you're only picking up 55% of the votes, you should also only be occupying about 55% of the seats. So you're trying to equalize these two pie charts. You're trying to closely correspond how Ohioans actually vote with who's able to actually hold those seats. This obviously would be a huge improvement over our current districts where there is not any representational fairness, right? We see a huge lopsidedness in how we vote versus who actually wins our legislative seats. So this is an incredibly important criterion, especially for the state legislative districts. There isn't a similar criterion for the congressional maps. One of the holes in the reforms, but these are the criteria. They will be extremely helpful in safeguarding against some of our worst forms of gerrymandering that we see under our current maps. So I will pause here just because I know that that was a lot of information, just to see if there are any questions from folks. I see one in the chat box. How easy is it for them to get around the if possible rule? Good question. So for the state house districts, I think this is what you're asking after. The way that the house districts will be drawn is you start with the most populous county, which is Franklin County, and you try to draw as many whole districts within the county boundaries as you can. And then you're allowed to include whatever the leftover population is and connect it to only one bordering county. So if you're looking at Franklin County, for example, let's say, I'll just make it a round number and say that you could fit 10 whole house districts inside our county, but there's a little bit left over for an 11th district. You would only be able to connect that, for example, up into Delaware County only. You would not be able to split it out into other counties. And you do that from the most populous county to the least populous county. And what you're trying to do is create as many whole districts within county boundaries as possible to get as few county splits as you can in the map. So there will be inherently some districts where you'll have to split the counties more than a single time just because of the way that geographically you've sort of paired up the other counties. So that's what the if possible means. I will say though too, there are also additional rules about how, especially for the state legislative map, the rules are just way more prescriptive than they are for the congressional maps. This is largely due to the fact that they were two very different negotiation processes. So the state ledge process, that ballot measure came out of a partisan negotiation in 2015. And quite frankly, I don't know why the Republicans agreed to a lot of the rules that they agreed to. I think they learned their lesson so that when they came back in 2018, they didn't agree to a lot of the same stricter rules, which is why you see such a vast difference between the state legislative and congressional rules. So in the state legislative rules, even though they're more prescriptive, there are a lot of, well, you should draw the district this way and you can split a community only if these certain situations exist, but if you absolutely can't do that, here's an escape route. And if you absolutely can't do that, here's another escape route. So there are definitely some exceptions that apply that aren't necessary, but that you could use to further gerrymander the maps. Okay, let me see what other questions are in the chat box. This is pretty specific, but how severely do we think that the process will be affected by recent unplanned delays in the census data? Evan, that's a great question. I'm actually going to pin that question because I'm going to talk about that in a few slides. So we will talk about that, but I want to get to the other rule specific questions. And then I'll get back to that question, Evan. It's a good one. David Wasserman posted on Twitter that that Republicans could potentially redraw the maps so that it would be a 13-2 Republican Democratic split without breaking the rules. Wasn't sure if his picture was correct. So David Wasserman's map is not actually fully legal. That's not to say you couldn't draw a 13-2 map. He actually had too many county splits in his map, so his was not a good map. There is still a way to draw an extremely gerrymandered congressional map. And a lot of that actually has to do with how you're allowed to split major cities. So this is getting into more detail than I have here, but will be included in the handout that I send to Tara. But for the congressional maps, there are rules about how, if at all, you're allowed to split certain major cities. So Columbus is too big to all fit into one congressional district, so we have to be split apart. Cleveland and Cincinnati, though, cannot be split apart. They have to remain whole within their districts. And what the 13-2 map does is, rather than responsibly drawing a Cincinnati-anchored Hamilton County district, they take the city of Cincinnati in its entirety, and then they just sink it into the surrounding conservative counties around it, and just totally sink that into a Republican district. They do similar things with other major cities like Toledo and Akron and Dayton, which don't have similar protections around splitting them apart. So this is actually a perfect point to bring up to illustrate that these reforms alone will not deliver us fair maps. The criteria are not perfect. The reforms were the result of partisan negotiations. There is still a lot of room, not a lot, there's a significant amount of room for gerrymandering to occur and for the process itself to not be transparent. I cannot stress enough why it is so crucially important then for all of us to be applying as much public pressure, not only against the Republicans, who obviously are going to want to try to keep the districts looking as close to status quo as they can, but to also hold Democratic allies accountable to actually hold the line to get the fairest maps possible. So yeah, unfortunately that 13-2 map, there was also a Republican leaning blog who drew a very similar map. And so if you're thinking about, oh, you know, these criteria are really good, what's the worst that can happen? That 13-2 map is your answer. What is AOTL's position on expanding the number of seats in the US House of Reps from the current 435? I don't think we have an organizational position on that. I have my own personal opinions about increasing statehood, but we don't have one for the organization. From Tara, so to summarize, to get a 10-year map, Democrats have to agree, otherwise more rules kick in, correct? And the only way to keep them honest in that instance is to take them to court. This is true for the congressional process. For the state legislative process, the rules are the same no matter if it's a 10 or a 4-year map. For the congressional process, though, Tara, you're right that if the legislators go forward with a 4-year map, there are more stringent and actually better rules that apply. So when you're thinking strategically, like a 4-year map sounds bad, but you could actually get a better congressional map if you force them to go to the final step to get a 4-year map. And in terms of keeping them honest about it, yes, certainly going to court is one of the ways to make sure that the maps actually follow the new criterion, both in terms of what the maps have to look like, but also in terms of what the process has to look like.
Can I just clarify then?
Sure.
Can they pass can they pass a 10-year map at all without Democratic support?
No.
Okay.
No.
So they need a third of.
Yeah, here, let me hold on a second.
Democrats to pass.
Yeah, no worries. I'm gonna bring up a different PowerPoint presentation that has the breakout.
Because I mean, I think, you know, that's the thing that I've been hearing for 3 or 4 years is that like they could still pass pretty crappy maps.
Yes.
Even under these rules.
Yeah.
If they can just pick off enough Democrats to go along with it.
Correct.
Probably it's going to be easier in the legislature than in like the commission.
Yeah.
Where those will be like hand-selected people.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Well, in that case, if they do a 10-year map and they get the Democrats to buy in, it could be a bad map.
Correct.
Right? Like those rules don't apply, at least with the.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So this is a congressional process.
Oh, wow.
Let me try to zoom out so it's all on the screen. So the congressional process, it has 4 steps. And again, I will send this out so that you all have it for your reference. But so in the first step, it starts with the legislature, and they have to get at least 60% support in each chamber, and then at least 50% support of the Democrats in order to get a 10-year map. If they can't do that in the legislature, it goes out to the Redistricting Commission. The commission rules then apply, which means they have to get at least 2 Republicans and both of the Democratic commissioners to vote in favor of it in order to get a 10-year map. If they can't get that level of bipartisan support, it goes back to the legislature again, and they get one more shot to get a 10-year map. This time, though, even though they have to get 60% in both chambers, they only have to get a third of the Democrats to sign on. And then they have one final option, which is to push forward with a 4-year map with just a simple legislative majority. But that map would have the additional rules that apply. And so when I say that this additional, so these are the additional rules that apply. This is where you see the ban on partisan gerrymandering for congressional maps. So if you're thinking about that, and any of these steps for a 10-year map, for congressional maps, there is no explicit ban on partisan gerrymandering. Now, we will be advocating for them to effectively use the rules for this 4th step for the entire process, because if you're thinking about it from a negotiations perspective, there's no reason why you should agree to anything that you aren't guaranteed to get in this step in steps 1 through 3, right? If I know that if I push you to step 4, I'll get a ban on partisan gerrymandering, why would I accept it in steps 1 through 3, right? So that's what we're going to be pushing for them to operate under. And then the additional rules, they're just more strict rules against splitting apart communities. And then the most important additional rule that applies for the 4-year map on the congressional map is that if they go forward with this, they have to write a statement that explains how they met those additional criteria. And the reason that's most important is for litigation, because that then is your evidentiary record, because you have them explaining how they think they didn't partisan gerrymander, how they really didn't unnecessarily split apart communities, and how they attempted to draw compact districts. And then you could use that against them if you don't actually think that they did. All right, let me, are there any other questions about the process itself or the criteria? Okay, cool. I will go back then to this other, there we go. Okay, so like I said at the top, one of the most important things that we can all do is actually engage with this process. There are a couple of opportunities for public engagement that are actually baked into the process rules itself. But there are way more opportunities that we're actually going to have to create outside of the official process. One of those, for example, is hosting town halls with our legislators before the redistricting process even begins this summer in 2021. If you're just thinking generally about what the legislative timetable is for this year, in a couple of weeks, Governor DeWine will drop his next 2-year operating budget. The budget is the biggest vehicle through which we implement policy at a state level. So it is an incredibly impactful legislative process that impacts all of our communities, what resources are coming into it, what programs we're able to engage with that are funded by the state. And that process takes us all the way until the end of June. And then when the end of June comes, the legislators all go home for a summer recess, and they're usually home for July and August. And when they're all at home for their summer recess, that is a perfect opportunity for us to be badgering them to hold town halls, or for us to organize empty chair town halls, for us to say, okay, listen, you just went through this massive policy process. We probably have a lot of feelings about what you either did or didn't fund in that budget. And we want to talk to you about that. But we also are at the outset of another hugely impactful process with redistricting. And the process is brand new, and the rules that guide how the maps are drawn is brand new. And we want to know, as your constituents, how you're going to engage us in that process, how you're going to make sure that our voices are heard during this process, and in the maps that are ultimately drawn. So one of the good things about being on the losing side of gerrymandered districts for a decade is that you actually get very good at doing forced transparency work, because that's all you have to offer. So that's going to be a huge key in a lot of our engagement. There are also, though, like I said, some opportunities that are explicitly baked into the process. One of those is public hearings that have to take place for both the state leg and congressional maps after maps have been publicly proposed, but before the maps are adopted. The reason this timing is important is because in 2011, when the Apportionment Board and members of the committees that are in charge of redistricting in the legislature went across the state to talk to people about redistricting and about the maps that they were drawing, they didn't actually bring any maps with them for people to react to or to look at. And so when negotiators went to the table in 2015 and 2017, they said, listen, you're not going to do that. We actually need to be able to react to something in these hearings. And so it's incredibly important that this sort of timing information is included in when these hearings have to take place. What I will say, though, is that that's the only rule that guides when those hearings take place. There aren't any rules, for example, about how far out before you vote on them they have to take place. There aren't any dates by when those hearings have to take place. There are rules about how many of them have to take place, although there's just a small number of bare minimum hearings that are required. So you have to hold at least 3 public hearings for the state ledge maps, at least 2 for the congressional maps. Even if you combine those 2 numbers, that is not nearly enough to adequately engage all of us around Ohio in this process. If it were up to me, we'd be hosting at least 1 public hearing in every single congressional district for each set of maps. And being able to make sure that those hearings are actually accessible for everybody. So that includes not only in-person opportunities, if that's actually safe come late fall, but also including virtual options, having it at times of the day and on days of the week when it's actually accessible to as many people as possible, and doing it in locations where people have access to go to them and have their voices heard. Finally, one other piece that is really important in terms of public engagement is the ability for all of us as members of the public to actually propose our own maps to legislators and the commissioners. Now, for both the state legislative and congressional process, you're allowed to propose maps, but only for the congressional process are the legislators required to consider them. So the commissioners are not actually required to consider any publicly proposed maps. Obviously they should, and we encourage people to be proposing maps. And the reason that this is an important thing to engage in is that during the process itself, you want to have as many good alternative maps entered into the conversation to say, you all are proposing this map over here, and yet there are 20 Ohioans who drew maps that meet all the same criteria that you had to meet, and they're way more fair and way more representative than whatever you're proposing. And why aren't you looking at all of these maps? It's also important, though, for any potential litigation challenges after the maps are drawn, to be able to say, there were other alternatives that the legislature or the commission could have taken in how they drew districts. It was in fact possible not to crack apart this community. It was in fact possible not to partisan gerrymander this specific part of the state. You could see that in these maps that got proposed, and instead they did it this other way. So that's actually a really, really important piece of the public engagement opportunity. In terms of what we're actually looking at in terms this year and what all the months ahead require, is AOTL going to propose a map that they consider fair? I know that there's a tool for drawing maps. Is AOTL offering this tool or training for it? Great questions. And Scott, I see your question too. I'll answer that in just a second. And Evan, as you see, that census question is here, so I promise I'll get to that too. I'm not sure if AOTL itself will propose maps. What I can tell you, though, is that I help co-lead a coalition, actually Tara does too, of a diverse coalition of progressive partners who are all coming together on redistricting. And one of the activities that we are going to stand up with our grassroots mobilization committee is a People's Map Commission that is going to run parallel to the official process and will be rooted solely in having grassroots-led conversations in communities across Ohio to talk about what our communities actually need in new maps. And I would encourage you, once we get that stood up, hopefully next month, to go to those hearings. We won't be, for folks who are actually engaged in mapping, what I'll say is just a quick aside, is if you were interested in literally going into Maptitude or some other mapping software and drawing maps, the Common Cause and League of Women Voters run a map drawing competition, and they will be running it again this year. And you should definitely reach out to them when they start putting up their trainings to do that. It's a great opportunity to learn how to actually go through that mapping software. There's also a really accessible tool. It's called Districtor. It's spelled like this. And it's a community mapping tool that was built by some mathematicians at Tufts, who we will also be working with for our People's Map Commission. You can also go to Days Redistricting. That's another public redistricting site. Also, if you want to just like play a game of redistricting, when I was in law school, I think it's called the Redistricting game. I think it's fairly straightforward, but my law professor made us play it. It sort of looks like a 90s video game, but you have like 5 different missions that you have to get through. One is to partisan gerrymander. One is, to protect incumbents. And it's a good way to understand why drawing lines is actually incredibly difficult to balance all the various different interests that are at play. I'm not saying that you should gerrymander. It's actually quite possible to draw maps and not do that. But there are a ton of different tools that are publicly available that I would encourage you to play around in, to get more familiar with that. And once we get our People's Map Commission up and running, I'm sure Tara will share with you all the links to those hearings around the state and here in Columbus, where folks can get plugged into that mapping work. Okay, so I want to answer the census question, and then I want to answer the question about what happens with folks who are imprisoned. So the census question is a major outstanding question. I don't have a specific date about when we will get our census data. The census data in terms of the impact on redistricting comes out in 2 different sets of data. One set is the reapportionment data, which determines how many US House seats every state gets. Ohio will likely lose one of our districts, so we'll go down to 15 congressional districts instead of 16. And then the second set of data is all of the population and demographic data, and that shows where the shift in population has happened over the course of the last 10 years as reflected by the census. Obviously, the release of both sets of data has been delayed because of COVID, and also because there are an incredible amount of data irregularities that the Census Bureau is trying to figure out. I wouldn't be shocked if we didn't see our data until May or June of this year. Which means that we will have a very, very tight turnaround in terms of how quickly after we get that data, we will then have to turn around and adopt maps, because that first deadline is September 1st for our state legislative maps, and then September 30th for the congressional maps. So I will keep you posted as I learn more about what that census data release looks like. But yes, it will be a very, very quick turnaround for us. In terms of what happens with prison populations, traditionally how Ohio has done redistricting, and this is true for a lot of states across the country, we count people who are in prison where they are imprisoned and not at a last known address. This is something, a practice called prison gerrymandering, because if you're thinking about where prisons are actually located in Ohio, and also which communities are disproportionately represented in prison populations, you know that there are a bunch of rural white counties that get a whole bunch of additional people counted in those counties who are not actually from those counties. There's no rule that requires us to draw districts that way. And I actually think that there's some, I think, convincing jurisprudence from Ohio courts that would actually dictate that we should be counting people who are in prison at a last known address where their residence is, rather than where they are imprisoned. But that is a piece of advocacy that should be directed at the map drawers themselves, to say we should not be counting people where they are imprisoned. We should be counting them where they're actually from. That would help balance out where those numbers are actually represented. Okay, let me see what other questions. 2 questions. What do you think is the benefit of publicly submitted maps, and how should orgs like GSA engage members in the process? Yes, you're right that felons can't vote. That doesn't, well, for the purposes of redistricting, in terms of population numbers, the Ohio Constitution requires that we count every person in Ohio to determine how many people should live in every district. So to live up to the promise of one person, one vote, we count every person in Ohio and then divide that by the number of districts to find that. But certainly when you're talking about the ripple effects of what happens when we prison gerrymander, and also then that there are people who are in prison who can't vote, or who are outside of prison and can't vote. Yes, you're absolutely right, Scott. Okay, Tara, to your question, the benefit of publicly submitted maps is that what you're trying to do is to provide as many good alternatives to whatever bad maps are being proposed by the official process. And so if all that you have to look at is whatever is being proposed by the supermajority Republican legislature, you're likely not looking at as fair a map as could be drawn. And so the benefit of having publicly submitted maps is twofold. Number one, they're maps that are sourced by regular Ohioans. The redistricting process should be ground up. It should not be top down. We should be going into communities and asking people what they want or need out of their districts in order to responsibly draw communities. That will actually be the mission of our People's Map Commission. And so what you're trying to do by having publicly proposed maps is these are maps that are drawn by committee members themselves. The other is just a direct accountability piece to say if there are, regular Ohioans who have to meet all the same criteria that legislators or the commissioners have to meet, and they're all able to draw maps that are more fair and representative of Ohio, why can't you, right? So that to me is the benefit during the process. Like I said, there's obviously benefits after the process if you're going through litigation to establish that there were other alternatives that they could have used. In terms of how groups like DSA can engage, I lifted up both the map drawing competition that the League and Common Cause run, but also once our coalition stands up the People's Map Commission, that's another really great way to engage. So the basis of the conversation, hang on, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen because I wanna see all of your faces. So the benefit of the People's Map Commission is that the conversations will all be not literally in how you draw your districts, but rather talking in a qualitative way about how you actually define what your communities are. So I live in Clintonville. I grew up in Clintonville, so I have a very sort of old school definition of where Clintonville's boundaries are. We've sort of annexed a lot of Beechwold. And so I wouldn't define Clintonville going north of Henderson, let alone Morse Road, but there are a lot of other people that have very different definitions of what Clintonville is. So we would be having a conversation with folks who live in my neighborhood, and we would talk about what do you think the actual bounds of your community are, right? And what are some other neighboring communities that have similar enough interests that it would make sense for all of us to be in the same district? And based on all of those qualitative conversations, you then draw a map that reflects what communities are saying defines where they live and who should be kept together, which communities are okay to crack apart in responsibly drawn districts. That's another really great opportunity for folks to get engaged in that process. And then out of that entire People's Map Commission, the commission will draw a map that it will then offer to the official process. That is sort of the culmination of all those qualitative conversations. Any other questions about the process itself?
Are you going to talk about timing?
Yes.
Yeah. Because like if we're going to go to the end of November, like when's the filing deadline to file to run in these new districts? I know that's something that we as an organization are going to be really interested in recruiting members to run pledge districts.
Yep.
We don't know where the districts are going to lie until potentially like a couple weeks before you have to file.
So you'll have a couple months. So the primary for 2022 will be in February because it'll be a May primary because it's a non-presidential year. So we won't have the primary in March like we did this year. So the absolute latest date that you can get a state legislative map is September 15th. And the absolute latest date that you can get a congressional map is November 30th. So at the absolute latest for the congressional maps, you'll have 2 months to, a little more 2 months to file. And then the state ledge maps, obviously you get way more time because they finish in September 15th.
Okay. I didn't know it was that early.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right, well, let me reshare, and then what I'll do is I'll skip ahead to how you can actually get involved. Oh, I forgot to update this date again. Okay, so one of the things that is super important for us is talking to people about why redistricting matters, how folks can actually plug into this fight. So if you have other groups or organizations who might be interested in going through a virtual training like this, please be in touch. One of the silver linings of being in the virtual space is it's relatively easy logistically to set up one of these trainings. So please be in touch. Our next monthly volunteer call is not on January 11th, it's February 8th. I forgot to update this slide before tonight. I will send a follow-up email to you, Tara, that has all the links to all this stuff. But I have monthly volunteer calls on the second Monday of every month. It's a good way just to sort of chunk out the work that we have ahead when you're thinking about generally the next 9 months that we will go through this entire redistricting process. That's a lot to take in. So the monthly volunteer calls are a good way to just drill down on specifically what we're working on in the next couple of weeks and what major calls to action exist. So would love for all of you to join those as well. One other thing that we are working on is to demand that the legislature allow for virtual testimony at all legislative hearings. This is something that certainly is going to be important for redistricting down the line, but is important right now, and especially as we're about to embark on the budget process. The State House is literally and also figuratively not a safe place to be. Many legislators refuse to wear masks while the pandemic is still raging and vaccines are slow to get out. It's not safe for advocates to actually go down to the State House to give testimony in legislative hearings. And yet that's one of our only opportunities to ever be heard by our legislators, because we certainly aren't at the ballot box because of how our district lines are drawn. Providing an opportunity to give virtual or remote testimony is a really easy fix to make the legislative process more accessible, and not just during a pandemic, but always. It's not accessible to force people to go down to the State House. Even if you live in Columbus, it's not particularly an accessible building. So we have a call to action into Speaker Cup and Senate President Huffman to demand that we get virtual testimonies. This will obviously be very important for the redistricting process when we'll want to ensure that folks have a way to accessibly go to those redistricting hearings. Finally, we have a letter to the editor tool. One of the easiest ways to start these conversations is actually just talking to your friends and neighbors about why this issue is important, how your community has been impacted by gerrymandering. We have a couple of different letter to the editor campaigns up. One is about virtual testimony. The other is actually in support of HR 1, which is a federal bill that is a sweeping voting rights bill that would do tremendous things to make our democracy more accessible, specifically to redistricting. It would do things like prohibit partisan gerrymandering for all congressional maps, which would be a great protection. It also sets up independent redistricting commissions, which would not go into effect this redistricting cycle, but would mean future redistricting cycles would be much more fair. And a litany of other examples of things that would make our democracy more fair and accessible to folks. So would encourage you all to check that out as well. So that's all that I have. I know that there are some questions, so I'm gonna unshare my screen and see what the questions are. Yeah, so the states, I'll write out all the dates. The state ledge deadlines are September 1st or September 15th if needed. And then the congressional maps deadlines are September 30th, October 31st, or November 30th. And you only go through those if needed. So those are the dates where all the deadlines are. Do you think what was passed in Michigan, shown in the documentary Slay the Dragon, is a good or fair way of drawing maps? Also, do you see it being possible to run a campaign like that here? I will say that independent commissions are by far and away the fairest way to draw maps. The further you remove the process from a partisan negotiation, the better. Redistricting should be a nonpartisan process. It should not be, the people who are drawing maps should not also be the same people who are running under those maps or who want to run under those maps. We sort of have fixed that in Ohio, in that the congressional maps are drawn by the commission, the state legislative maps aren't drawn by the state legislators, they're drawn by the commission. But that commission is full of elected politicians who all have their own self-interests. I think the Michigan process is more fair than Ohio's in that way alone. I think the rules here help. We will get fairer maps than we have now, which is a really important improvement. But to me, independent commissions are the way to go. If there's any legal or logistical delays to the census data, is there any recourse for redrawing Ohio maps? There might be. So one of the things that I'm thinking most directly is, so the due dates that I just listed in the chat box for when the maps are due, those are all constitutional deadlines in our Ohio Constitution. So they're very stern deadlines. What I'm curious about is if the census is so delayed that there is no feasible way for us to go through the process and meet those constitutional deadlines, we would have to go to court to ask the Supreme Court to give us extensions for when those maps are due. So if you're thinking, for example, of some of the ballot measures in early 2020 that were trying to get off the ground right as the pandemic hit, and they went to the ballot board and the Supreme Court to ask for extensions in their deadlines. Same sort of thing here. If there's no viable way that we'll be able to draw maps if the census is so delayed, that's definitely something that we would have to do. In terms of if there's, and I don't know, Scott, if you're asking about like the integrity of the data, certainly there would perhaps be a cause of action if there's an issue with the integrity of the data itself. Any other questions?
I have a quick question. Yeah, I think it might just be that I missed something earlier. You were talking about the idea of like a People's Maps Commission, I think you said, and how like citizens can contribute or districting maps. Excuse me. Can you just remind me exactly like how one gets involved with that and what exactly?
Yeah, so the People's Map Commission is something that a coalition of organizations is going to stand up. I think it's next month. We are partnering with university partners at the Kirwan Institute at OSU and with some university partners at Tufts, the people who actually make the Districtor tool. And one of the key strategies that this commission will have is to host public hearings around the state where folks like all of you can come to the hearings and talk about how best to map your community to fit whatever your community looks like and what your community needs. So as soon as I get information about that, I will share it with Tara, and then Tara will shoot it out to all of you about how to get engaged in those. And then the other thing, if you're actually interested in literally drawing maps and want to learn how to do that, the map drawing competition that the League of Women Voters and Common Cause stands up is another opportunity to plug in that way.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, one more thing.
Yeah.
What institute at Ohio State did you say is involved with that?
It's the Kirwan Institute. It's I think their full title is the Kirwan Institute. It's a Center for Racial and Ethnic Studies, I think is the full name of it's not a separate college at OSU. It's sort of I don't know how to describe it in like the hierarchy of how OSU works. I think it's separate from Glenn College. It's a building, it's literally right across the street from the law school. But it's a great resource for us here in OSU. They center racial and ethnic studies in everything that they do. So it's super helpful for us in trying to ensure that especially BIPOC communities are engaged in this process and centered. Any other questions? All right, well, thanks everybody. I appreciate your time. I know we went over a little bit. I will follow up with Tara with the flow chart that explains all the intricacies of how the process works. It's a doozy of a process. Ohio has one of the most complicated redistricting processes in the country. All of my fellow state directors across the country always joke that they have no idea how I remember anything about my process. But if you have any other questions, please feel free to be in touch. Really looking forward to sort of jumping into this. I'm so glad that we're now finally in 2021. So let me know if there's anything else that you all need. And feel free to follow us on social media. If you too are not a fan of Frank LaRose, I often tweet about how much I dislike him. So feel free to give me a follow too. And thanks everybody for joining.
Katie, drop your Twitter handle or something.
Oh yes, Twitter is
the organization.
Shanahan, and then there's at All on the Line Ohio too.
All right, thank you so much, and I'm going to stop the recording now.